Welcome back to Heightscast, the podcast of the Heights School. This is Rich Moss with you from the campus of the Heights in Potomac, Maryland. We're here to talk about the education and the formation of young men fully alive in the liberal arts tradition. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for continuing to share us, our mission, and our vision of education with your friends. We're very, very grateful, as always. Today, I'm delighted to share with you a conversation that we had with Father Carter Griffin. Father Carter is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and rector at the St. John Paul II Seminary in D.C. He's published several books with Emmaus Press, including Why Celibacy, Cross-Examined, Forming Fathers, and most recently, Forming Families, Forming Saints, which addresses us as parents as we do our best to raise the next generation of Catholics. It's a beautiful book, just full of insights and Father Griffin's experience from the seminary. Also, lots of beautiful art and, all sorts of book lists. I mean, it's really wonderful. So excited to share this conversation with you. Before we get to the conversation, a couple of announcements. First, we will have our Teaching Essentials workshop this summer, June 16th through the 20th. This will feature our own Mr. Austin Hatch and his colleague, Mr. Tom Steenson. So two veteran teachers with a wealth of experience who will share some of that wisdom with teachers interested in honing their craft. So a bit of the philosophical, but a whole lot of the practical. And so I think if you are a teacher and you're interested in just refreshing your craft, or especially if you're a newer teacher, this would be a marvelous, marvelous way to kick off the summer. This is a conference open to teaching men. To register, visit heightsforum.org, and you can register there. It should be really great. Incidentally, last week's podcast featured Mr. Hatch, and Mr. Hatch was also on the recent Forum Faculty podcast on textbooks. So if you'd like to get a sense for what you're getting into, do give those a listen. Again, it should be absolutely awesome. We also will host our conference for Heights parents on April the 12th of 2025. So a great day. The theme of the conference is Tell the Next Generation that Such is Our God. And so the idea is, how do we pass the faith to our sons? A whole lot there for us with our daughters as well. But how do we pass on the faith to our sons? What does that mean? How do we do it in an environment of freedom? How do we teach our sons to pray? What is prayer anyway? So all these things we'll talk about and a whole lot more. But we'll be led in these efforts by our headmaster, Mr. Alberto Vicente, by our lower school head, Mr. Colin Gleason, and the middle school head, Mr. Andy Reed, who each of them will just address different aspects of this question. What is faith? What is prayer? How do you foster a contemplative disposition in our sons? So it should be a really, really great day. Open to Heights parents and, of course, your friends from beyond the walls. This is open to the broader DC community. And if you're outside the DC community, you want to come and pay us a visit, you're very welcome. This is April the 12th, 2025. To register or learn more, visit heights.edu. Okay, so all that aside, here's a conversation with Father Carter Griffin about his new book, Forming Families, Forming Saints, in which he draws on the four pillars of formation that he uses in the seminary: the human, spiritual, intellectual, and apostolic. There is so much in this book, and so we were only able to scratch the surface, but I still think it was a scratch worth making with a great friend of the Heights. Thanks for listening, and enjoy this conversation. Father Carter, welcome to Heightscast. It's great to have you on again.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
And congratulations on the new book, Forming Families, Forming Saints. It's a really wonderful book, and I loved it. My family's benefiting from it, so thank you for writing it, and thanks for coming to talk to us about it.
Absolutely, it was actually fun to write. It was a great project.
Yeah, I can imagine, because it seems like you pull from. I mean, you share lives of the saints. You share anecdotes from just your own experience in the seminary, just so many different places, great art. I mean, it's a beautiful book aesthetically.
Yeah, I was
awesome.
Really impressed. Emmaus Road did it. It's from the St. Paul Center, kind of founded by Scott Hahn, and they've just got a great crew there. But they have some really, really talented designers too, and I just think they did an amazing job with it. I love the cover. There's a really cool story behind that cover. It's the I need to learn the whole story, but it's the Catholics who went to Australia, and something happened to the priest. Either the priest didn't make it or died or something. But it was just these Catholic families that were down there with the Blessed Sacrament, and so you have this beautiful experience of them growing closer to the Lord, waiting, for the priest eventually to come. But it's that sense of they were really forming their families, and they were forming them into these really tight Catholic units, that were able to withstand a lot of persecution and all kinds of things that were going on. So there's a beautiful story of the family has a certain kind of God-given power, to the family unit itself, and So I think part of the goal was to try to highlight some of that and help to foster some of that in the families.
It's such a great tone setter for the whole book, and so I think that this is a great place to begin. We'll launch into a little bit of an overview of the book in a second, but let's start there. I mean, you mentioned this power specifically that the family has, this calling. And one of the phrases that you mentioned early on is this idea that the family or the home, maybe more specifically, is a domestic church. Can you just share with us a little bit of that? What exactly does that mean? How should we hear that as parents?
Well, I think that what the church is an institution founded by Christ to form disciples in a very intentional way, and to send them forth into the world, right? And to bring the gospel to every creature. And that's what the family does, right? The family is that which kind of generates and forms and sends out disciples of Jesus Christ. And so what you see in the church is a very large family. We call the Pope the Holy Father. We have that sense of unity and communion among ourselves. That's the church sort of writ large, and sort of the smallest cell of that, which retains that kind of basic structure and focus and mission, is in the family. And so to have a real sense of that ecclesial sort of foundation of the family and the ecclesial sort of, I guess, contours of the family helps, I think, parents understand their own role vis-a-vis each other, but also especially in relationship with their kids, and helping to know what that looks like, that they've been entrusted with a beautiful, momentous, maybe terrifying responsibility for which Jesus Christ takes responsibility too, right? And that parents are not doing it alone any more than priests and the Holy Father are doing it alone. And so I think there's a sense that there's a sort of a terror that comes with both of our vocations, but also a deep, deep consolation.
And I would like to close, I think, in the end with hope, and it's so beautiful that you just kind of gave the preview of the end, which is very hopeful. But one of the things that I loved about this book, we just shared, kind of places the family, the home, in that context of the church, and in a way, it seems like homes and families are very much part of the church. Likewise, what I came away from this book feeling was that, wow, the church is also part of my family in a way. Like this whole legacy of, my goodness, Saint Therese and all the beautiful churches and the monasteries and the abbeys and the books that are written. You've got so many great book lists in here. Like all of that is not just something that I'm called to sort of be subsumed into, which, although I am in a way, but it's also, all that is there for me. That's our tradition. That's our legacy. And it's like, it's this amazing reminder that, wow, you're not alone. You've got thousands of years of beauty and resources at your disposal, and here's like this wonderful guide to put it in your living room table.
I think that's so true. And one of the reasons why I said at the beginning I enjoyed writing the book, I sort of found it fun, is because I've been doing seminary formation for a long time. I'm in year 14 of doing that, and working with young men who are discerning the priesthood and being formed for the priesthood. And I would have, over the years, different friends, couple friends, as they're having kids, raising kids and so forth, and talking to them. I'm asking what's going on in their life. They're asking what's going on in mine, and I'm talking about the seminary and what we do. And over again, I would get this kind of like, that would be really helpful for us too, to have some kind of structure like that. Because just as you were saying, that lengthy, very deep, wise tradition that we all stem from as Catholics, that's at the service of all of us, including parents. And there's a lot that the church has to offer. And I think one thing, maybe just to kind of anticipate one question that people would very reasonably have, a celibate priest writing to Catholic parents to married couples. But one of the reasons why I think it's certainly not all encompassing, and there are many things that I could not talk about competently. But there is a lot that the church does in seminary. It's sort of her work of formation of Christian disciples, but in the most concentrated form, in the seminary. And there's a lot that she has learned over all those centuries, which can and should be, I think, placed at the disposal of parents who can profit from that. So that was really kind of the ultimate end, is to bring some of the things that I've learned in formation in the seminary and make them available in a way that's sort of translated into the key of family life.
Beautiful. I love that. Yeah, and we'll kind of, we'll get into the organization of the book in a second, because I also think it's really cool how you laid it all out for us. But at the outset, you have a quote, I think in the introduction, that really was, it kind of hit close to home. Because I guess who are, in general, we have folks who are many, great, many people who are trying to be great Catholics who are listening. Yeah. We also have some folks that are outside the church, or perhaps even non-believers I know who listen to this. But here within this context of Washington, D.C., and a lot of really great, hard-charging, hard-working folks, there was a line that hit me, and I would love to just hear you say more about it. You write in the introduction that we spend more time trying to live well-calibrated, optimized lives, without actually living good and meaningful lives. And it seemed like when I read that, I was like, gosh, you know what? It's interesting that you can even try to be, well calibrated, and you can try to optimize your faith and your faith life and your family life in a way that perhaps even you miss out on that, just the good and the meaningful part of it. So I think just, let's see how to put this. The idea that how should we approach, like you have this treasure trove of the Catholic tradition, and how should we, as hard-charging Washingtonians, approach this information, given that we spend so much of our time trying to live well-calibrated, optimized lives? How should we receive this?
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think there is a way of receiving it which could just sort of feed into that.
Yes.
Like these are more, we life hack ourselves to death.
That's well put.
Like constantly, tweaking here and tweaking there, and get a little bit, better sleep schedule, a little bit better nutrition, and this, that, and the other thing. And none of those things in themselves, of course, are bad, and many times they're really helpful and good. But our life is more than just sort of becoming the most efficient, productive human being we can possibly become, right? That we have this. We have and the church has a much broader kind of perspective of the human being, and so the goal really of life is not just to become more efficient, but become more fully human, more fully alive. It's the
motto.
Yeah, it's the motto of the Heights, right? And that sense of the wholeness and the comprehensiveness of formation is something that is one of the most important, I think, lessons from the church's experience of seminary formation that can be applied to families. In other words, that we're all going to be strong in some areas, we're all probably going to be weak in some areas, and that applies to everything in our life, including parenting. And so learning where we're strong and where we're weak is really helpful. And for that, you need a vision. You need a template. And it's not just going to be picking apart here and there, or become a little bit more optimized, And so I think the way that this book and other resources maybe like it can be used most effectively is by keeping that sense of the vision that what is actually contributing to a more meaningful life, to a more fulfilled life, to a more flourishing life. And as Catholics, of course, we believe that ultimately that means a life of pursuing holiness and being prepared for the life of eternity. And that sense of the completeness of life, that meaningfulness of life, is something that we can never lose. We can never lose sight of. There was the seminarians are right now making their way through Kevin Major's great optimal work program. And one of the things in a separate podcast that Dr. Major said was that one of the things we have to be aware of is that if we're going to live optimal work, if we're going to live the kind of life that is most meaningful, we're not going to be 100% efficient. We'll probably be more like 90% efficient, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to put a number to it. There's nothing wrong with working hard and but you need to leave those gaps. You need to leave places for the new sprouts to come up too. And it can't just be this kind of relentless slog through life and constantly getting more and more done. So I think that's what I was trying to capture at it, and maybe a way of using a book that keeps that integrity.
I love that.
Of the human being.
Totally. That's wonderful. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind before we dive in sometimes, because I like that line as well. We life hack ourselves to death. And there is, that's always a temptation. But this book, and in part through all the different means of delivering beauty to us as readers and as parents, I think the book really does a beautiful job of keeping that image front and center of just the beauty of the human experience, particularly of a human who's a son or daughter of the church. It's really wonderful. So let's dive into it. Can you share with us some about the organization of the church, the 4 pillars, and how that might relate to work in the seminary and the formation of the priests?
In fact, it was these have always been done, but it was first really articulated by St. John Paul II. So it's not that long ago. We actually have the sort of the definition of these 4 pillars of seminary formation, which are the same structure that I use in the book here. And those 4 pillars are the human, in whatever order, human, spiritual, intellectual, and apostolic. In the seminary, it's called pastoral, becoming a shepherd. But I think sort of translated to the family life, it's more apostolic, right? Going up, becoming apostles for others. And I think a way to think about those, maybe a shorthand, is that if you will, the kind of the spiritual is the vertical part of the cross, right? The intellectual is the horizontal, going through the mind of Christ, putting on the mind of Christ. The apostolic is the corpus, the body of Christ on the cross. We serve the body of Christ. We love the body of Christ. We serve our brothers and sisters. And the first one, human, is the earth, in which the cross is grounded. It's that sense that it's that without which the cross can't stand. And so I think one thing you mentioned, that there may be listeners and viewers who are not Catholic or even Christian, but we all have that humanity in common, and that sense that we can be in a common mission of discovering what it means to be fully human. And we also, as believers, believe that that's also the best context in which the faith can grow. So I think those are the 4 pillars. I think they're a helpful shorthand. They some have said that maybe a better symbol would be, or terminology would be, dimensions, because pillars sounds a little bit too sort of siloed and isolated, and I think there's some truth to that. I think pillars also have that sense of like being strong and holding you up, which I like. So there's, every analogy limps. But the one of the things that I find really interesting as we go through that is, and I try to identify some of those in the different introductions to each of the pillars, is how they each actually overlap and depend upon each other and serve each other. So, for instance, you can say that the spiritual, doesn't stand alone, but without the human, we wouldn't necessarily have the capacity, to have the discipline to go to prayer. I mean, it's something as simple as that. It's a very human thing, just the discipline of having a plan of life. Or without the intellectual, if you're not forming your mind, you don't have an object for your intellect, where's your prayer going to go? If you're not apostolic, if your prayer just becomes inwardly focused, it's not directed ever towards the good of others, then it's going to be a sterile prayer. So they all kind of feed on each other and lean on each other, but that's the basic structure.
Yeah, I love it. And it's neat how you begin with the human formation, which is so much of what we do. I mean, we do all of it as parents, but so much of it, particularly for those of us with younger children, we think about order and making one's bed and these sorts of things. But human formation, you're right, it's foundational. It can be tougher to sort of correct later in life. So it's really important. I think it's great that you start there. And as much as I would love to do this would be a 16-hour podcast and devote 1 hour to each of these topics, we can only pick a couple, sadly. But of order, sincerity, chastity, fortitude, and magnanimity, so much to say about each of those, and you write so beautifully. The one that I was hoping to get into a bit more today is this topic of sincerity, and again within the framework of the human formation pillar. What is sincerity? Why did you choose to you began with order, but sincerity is a close second. What is it? How should we think about it? Why did you put it at the front of the book?
Well, I think drawing from my own experience in the seminary, what I have found is creating an environment in which the seminarians really feel free and are free to share what's on their minds, what's on their hearts, has been, I think, one of the, if not the most important element of the success of the seminary. The fruitfulness of the seminary has been, and to see it with my own eyes. When something has happened or something from their past, whatever, something they need to bring up, something they're struggling with, and the freedom and the strength that comes from speaking the truth is, I've just seen it over and over and over again. I really believe it's kind of one of the conditions without which, the sine non qua, that would make, I think, family life far more fruitful if children felt themselves open and free to be sincere. So I think what it means fundamentally is having the fortitude to let oneself be known, right? And because there's a real risk that goes along with that, of being rejected, of being judged, whatever it might be. And so I think forging, maybe a better word, in a family environment in which children can do that. And that, I think, entails several things. I think it entails being disciplined when children tell us things that are difficult for us to hear, right? And it's like hearing confessions, like somebody confesses something. You did what?
You did what?
Yeah, I mean, that's Confessions 101. Don't say that. Don't react, And parents have to build a little bit of that into there, so that when whatever they're hearing, it's like, and that doesn't mean that you don't react appropriately, but I mean, it's always with the child's good in mind, never with a sense of, yeah, you did what, kind of thing, or you heard what, or your friend said what, or whatever it might be. It's always, okay, well, where do we go from here? Like, what's the next step, right? And how can the next step to help you, right? It's really and so I think kids pick up on that like osmosis. I mean, they'll know if they really are free. I think another thing that can prevent, aside from the shock, that can prevent kids from being open is if they feel that somehow everything they say is being sort of heard through the lens of your own expectations for them, right? And what you want them to be. And we all have that temptation, right? And to make those that are entrusted to our care kind of images and likenesses of ourselves, rather than more fully who God has made them to be. And that's just a human temptation. But they'll kind of pick up on that too. I think if parents themselves are not modeling sincerity in one way or another, it's going to be hard for kids to do so. And one of the things I think, I'm sure from your own experience and working with a lot of parents, that parents need to learn how to be real with their kids, and that includes their own difficulties in marriage, not all the difficulties, but to be able to argue in front of the children in a way that shows that arguments don't mean you don't love each other, and arguments can have a resolution. That you don't make up arguments, but I mean, if there's just a little if kids never see their parents arguing, if they never see them squabbling a little bit, then they imagine the perfect marriage is a marriage without squabbles, and that's just not true. So that would be an example of making big decisions, and bringing the kids into those decisions, like somehow bringing the kids and like letting them see, like there may be things that we can't tell you because you're too young, or it's not appropriate, whatever. But basically, we have no secrets from you. You're our children, and so we're going to be open with you, and we expect you to be open with us. So those are some ways that I think we can create that environment. But it's a hard one. It's a hard one achievement. But when it is one, I think it's really, really an important aspect of how children can be raised in such a way that you actually are working with the real struggles that they have, and not just the ones we imagine that they have.
Yeah. There's a line you write that an old spiritual director shared with you, not necessarily your spiritual, but someone who'd been involved in this for a long time. I think the line was that truth is never a problem.
Father Ron Gillis.
Really?
Oh yeah. Legend here at the Heights, and he was my spiritual director. Yeah, the truth is never a problem. Yeah, unbelievable.
It's such a great line.
Yeah,
it's such a great line, and just one to keep in your back pocket as a parent. Just know, like, truth. Like, truth is not a problem.
Yeah.
It's just whatever it is. And I do want to go a little deeper into what you just said. You also caution us, as you just shared, against forcing our kiddos to live to meet our expectations. And I think in particular in, just maybe our own community here. I mean, I love being in DC. I absolutely love it. You see the Capitol building, you see the Supreme Court, you see, just all sorts of great places full of people working hard to do good things. But it is a place where we can kind of craft an image that we want our children to live up to in the same way that we craft our work. And we're very purposeful, we're deliberate, we're methodical, we're really good at it actually with our work. And sometimes we apply that to our children. And perhaps there's a different way that we should approach our kids. But how does that interfere with sincerity when we craft this image of our kids, and that doesn't come from a place of ill will. I mean, it can be very well intentioned. But how does that interfere with their then feeling like they can share with you the really hard things that they need to share?
Well, and actually, if I could just dovetail with that first, and that is one of the things I think that can also limit the freedom that children feel to be themselves is social media. And I don't mean to make that sort of the constant bugbear, but I mean it is generally not good for our kids. And one of the reasons is because it basically fosters this kind of life of posturing, and putting an air out there, putting an image out there, and then you have this image, and that becomes more real than yourself, right? And here I was reading recently about young women or girls who will put on makeup in such a way that it's actually not attractive in person, but it's done because they are basically videoing themselves all the day, and it looks better so they're living more for this avatar of themselves than themselves. And I think that social media can really contribute to that. And so in a way, what parents can do unintentionally perhaps is the same sort of things. They can have sort of an avatar of their child rather than who their child actually is. Yeah. I want to step back too, because, I think especially for younger children, for them to do something because mom and dad would be proud of them is perfectly fine. Yes. I think there's something really healthy and normal and great about that. I don't think I got a good grade because I wanted to get a good grade until I was, in the 8th grade or something like that. It was just I wanted to please my dad, my mom. And so I think that is something but it can't stay there, and you sort of have these. And I think the parents can be a big part of helping the child see, like, well, I would have been proud of you, even if you hadn't gotten that grade, and and learning about what really makes the child come alive, and like even if you're not particularly interested in that, well, you need to become interested in it because your child is, and then you can really affirm them in that, and like learning about whatever it is that is of interest to them, some sport or hobby or whatever it is, and so I think. It's kind of a gradation as they grow up, that sort of giving them not just permission, but really encouraging them to strike out on their own, and then allowing yourself to give that same kind of affirmation for something that you may not particularly see as that important or whatever, but it is important to your kid, at least for now, and to walk with them in that. I guess all of these things, like everything else, needs to be done in wisdom and moderation and temperance, right? Because it's not all just about sort of revolving around your child's every whim and interest. I don't mean that either, but I think there is something very real about us just doing an examination of conscience. Am I exploring what this child of mine and who this child of mine is destined to be by God with him or with her, in a way that's sort of like this mutual thing, like let's discover who you are in a certain regard, like what talents you have and what gifts you have, what interests you have, and so to be a part of that common mission rather than sort of imposing my own. And it's a back and forth. There's a little bit. There's certain things that kids do need to receive from their parents. I think even if they're not that interested, that the parents can suggest that they explore different avenues, and I think that's fine too. But so it's a little bit of a dance, but it's it's at least good to know that the dance is a two-way, that two partners are in it.
Absolutely, and that there's openness to the child. Yeah, that's a great adjustment of my initial question. I appreciate that, because it is, obviously we're going to have certain expectations of our kids. Yeah. And we should hope for a relationship where part of their desire for their own happiness includes some sense of making mom and dad proud. That's a beautiful thing. So You're absolutely right. But then being open to the temperament and everything you just said is awesome. So more to be said about both sincerity and about human formation, but we'll move on in the interest of time. And I really appreciated how you approached the topic of I don't know what I would call it. I think if I had to choose a word, it would almost be relationship with God, perhaps divine filiation, divine sonship, because there's a lot of different aspects that go into it. There's faith, there's a training of the mind, there's prayer, which is mentioned throughout the book, but you begin in this spiritual pillar. You begin talking about the just this relationship of us as children of God, and how to pass that awareness onto our kids. One of the quotes that really struck me, and again, the book is just full of great quotes, but one of them was from Saint Athanasius: "The Son of God became the Son of Man, so that sons of men might become sons of God." And I thought that was beautiful. I'd never heard it. So it also seems like that idea is so, as a parent, then that idea is so much bigger than just kind of keeping the kids Catholic. It's about something bigger. And so why did you choose this idea of divine sonship as kind of the opening salvo of the spiritual pillar, even before the question of faith, which you put in the intellectual pillar, which I thought was really interesting. But so really too big of a convoluted question, but maybe we just begin with relationship.
Sure.
As we try to introduce our children to God the Father, you began with this aspect of relationship, divine filiation. Why begin there, and why then put faith in the pillar of intellectual formation?
Yeah. So the children of God, becoming a son, becoming a daughter of God, I really believe, and this is not unique to me, it's I think a lot would agree with this, that this is sort of this is what our faith is all about. I mean, this is in a sense why Jesus came. Right? The incarnation was not just to kind of satisfy the penalty of sin, but it was actually to invite us into this relationship with God the Father. Say your Father and my Father, our Father who art in heaven. Right? It's this profound sense that we have been restored to our rightful dignity, the dignity that Adam and Eve had. A lot of the fathers would also talk about this notion of Christ becoming man was somehow sort of bringing all elements of creation into his person and redeeming all of it. An expression of the fathers was what was not assumed was not redeemed. So he had to assume our human nature, and in that, all of us, sort of the healing waters of baptism in the Jordan have been applied to all the waters of baptism, and we've each been brought into that, and that makes us truly dignified in the sight of God. I mean, He has willed us to be His children, and true children. I mean, adopted children, but in the order of grace with their sanctifying grace. And so I think learning about that, learning what the dignity of a child is. There was an old expression that in the ancient world, the only person who could wake up a king for a glass of water at 2 a.m. was the son, and that sense that we have that access to God the Father, that Jesus has given us that access. And so the most important thing we have to do not only is to supernaturally receive that regeneration in baptism and all the sacramental and other spiritual helps to grow in that way, but also to know it, right? To know that we are sons and daughters of God. It changes everything. It changes how we approach God. It changes how we approach each other, ourselves. I think Father Ron used to say it changes how you tie your shoes in the morning. I mean, it just changes us to the core of our being. And so what is a child, a child, the best qualities of child, there's a little sidebar, I think, like what is childlike and not childish, So we want to become childlike, not childish. But childlike is this beautiful combination of trust and openness, sincerity. We're just talking about that. A sense of kind of living in the present moment, right? A child doesn't have to worry too much about the future and doesn't dwell too much on the past. There's a sense of sort of knowing that everything is going to be okay, right? That he or she is in their parents' providence, if you will. We are in God's providential hand, and so even when things are difficult and we don't understand them, and children often don't understand difficult things, but they still trust their parents that they know what they're doing. And so I think that is at the foundation of our spiritual life. That's the foundation of the life of grace. It begins there. It folds out from there, and there's a lot that emerges from that and other aspects of it. But that's why I began with it.
That's great. And so then, how does that relate to what you the chapter that you headed with the word faith? And I think. Yeah, and you put faith in the intellectual formation pillar, so we could kind of dovetail, segue into that as well. Yeah. But in what way does what you know of this sacred deposit of the faith, how does that relate to this relationship of divine filiation, either in human beings or in formation, or take it in any direction that you like?
Yeah. Well, I imagine if somebody grew up in say an obscure family or maybe an orphan, and later were to learn that their parents were of noble blood, or the king or the prince, like that sense of discovering who you are, because parents are, of course, true and natural parents of their children, but they're also, in a way, they're kind of proxies, right, of God the Father, who is the Father of all of us. And so to discover that is an intellectual endeavor. I put faith certainly could have been under this. This is one of the areas where there's obviously going to be a fair amount of overlap.
Oh my gosh!
But the reason I wanted to put it in intellectual is because maybe partly due to the results of some elements of the Protestant Reformation. There is sometimes an understanding of faith which is simply kind of a question of, it really sometimes is almost more like hope, just sort of like this trust, trust in God, and that's faith. Whereas in a Catholic understanding, faith is a virtue in the mind, right? It's something that enables us to see. It's distinct, for example, from the rational knowledge that God exists. We can know that through reason, right? St. Paul says so in Romans. And we all know that from a fact. As long as our mind is unclouded. I know atheists struggle really hard to keep their dogmatic belief in the non-existence of God present. But for most people who don't have kind of that obstruction, it's pretty obvious all this came from somewhere. This is not a random collection of molecules. So there's an intelligent design and so forth. And so we can know, right, but that's not faith, right? And what faith is it's like, no, I could know that you exist, but I don't know you yet, right? And to know you, I have to have a lot more than just kind of some kind of an awareness of your physical existence. And I think that's true. I know that's true for God as well. That he had, and we can't do that. He has to reveal himself to us, which is why faith is a gift from God, given to us in baptism. And something that is nourished and flourishes through receiving revelation. And so it's under the intellectual, because forming our mind, we have all these different ways that we need to form our mind, and parents, of course, are concerned about their children reading and learning, biology and math and everything, and that's all really important too. But forming our mind with respect to our discipleship, becoming disciples of Christ, means forming our mind according to the teachings of the church, according to the scriptures. And that also means doing things like learning some of the ways that the faith can be misunderstood, and the way the faith needs to be sort of defended against charges that it's unreasonable, which it never is, or that it opposes science or truth or anything like that, right? So this is all kind of part of the intellectual work of the faith, which is kind of the sort of downstream of that gift, right, that we have, which we believe that gift is a gift from God, and so it's that the content or the object is God, but also the source is God, right? And who can neither deceive nor be deceived, right? So that's why our faith we can go to the stake for the faith. We can be martyred for the faith, for the truths of the faith, even though we can't empirically prove all of them, all of the aspects of our faith. We're willing to die for them because we know that God can never deceive us. So that's why I have it under the intellectual, and that's where I think it flows also from, as you were saying, the divine filiation, or becoming a son or daughter of God. It's that kind of growing awareness and what that means in my life and how I live my life, and what I give my life to, which is kind of ending with some of the vocation, which was one of the other elements that we have in the book. Yeah.
Right. And then this kind of also leads to the question of prayer. And prayer was not, it's not sort of it's not any particular aspect, but it's funny, I have a hard copy of the book because it's fantastic and beautiful, and I've got a Kindle copy of the book because I want to be able to text search it, and so I did a search for prayer, and it's all throughout, which is beautiful. It seems like it kind of transcends the four pillars, but you've got some really neat stories from families and others about how they've kind of introduced their kids to prayer, to this God that they have an increasing awareness of through their faith and a relationship with, through their awareness of their sonship, or their being daughters of this good Father. But prayer is also, it's an interesting one because I think this is a generation that is interested in immediate results, in pushing a button and getting the thing, whether it's the hamburger from Uber Eats or whatever, the plane tickets or the movie ticket or anything. And prayer is just so different. So as a school that's intensely interested in teaching its students to pray, as parents who are intensely interested in offering this gift to our children, how should we help how do we shape our children's understanding of prayer, and then how do we introduce them to it generally? It's a massive question, again, but just in general, what comes to mind for you as you've done all this work with great families?
No, thank you. And you're right. I sort of assumed I would have a chapter on prayer, but as I was kind of thinking through the organization of the book, I realized that it could actually be counterproductive in the sense that it could contribute to an idea that prayer is in fact just kind of another category of things to do, rather than something that permeates everything that we do.
I love that.
Right, and so I think hopefully seeing that in the different elements of the book, sort of seeing the prayer, that how our conversation with God, St. Teresa of Avila said, the lifting of the mind and heart to God, right? I mean, it's a very simple, kind of straightforward definition, our conversation with him. If we have a Father in heaven, surely we should talk to him, and he wants to talk to us. So that's prayer. I think, and it's a great point about kind of the instant gratification generation or generations. I think a couple of things. The Catholic Church has a very rich understanding of prayer and a very broad one. It's something that, we think about like the four kind of main categories of prayer, vocal and liturgical and mental prayer and contemplative prayer. There are other categories we could put in too, but introducing children to all of them at the beginning, I think, is important. It's not like, well, one day we'll get to mental prayer. No, that's what children, when they lisp their prayers before going to sleep. I mean, that's vocal prayer, but in a way, you're also, maybe with some silence there, encouraging them to speak to God. I think the earlier that all these different ways, praying a decade of the Rosary together for vocal prayer, bringing them obviously to the Mass for liturgical prayer, having a little bit of time, having 5 minutes in adoration, with the little ones, which grows as the children get older. And believe it or not, I think that contemplative prayer is the one that we can mistake most as something that's only reserved for kind of really the professionals later on. And I think kids can be real mystics, right? Kids can be contemplative, and have them just there and quietly, you can imagine the beauty of those prayers to our Father's ears, in heaven, so to speak. So I think having all of these different ways, now as children get older and they sort of, well, I prayed for this and it didn't happen. I think it's part of that sincerity, again, just always comes back. And if the child is saying that, then it's a great thing to talk about. What does it mean to have an unanswered prayer? Like, is in fact there is such a thing as an unanswered prayer? Maybe there are other ways that, as I think Padre Pio said, that there's always three answers, right? It's either yes or yes but not yet, or no because I have something better in mind. Like it's always one of those three, 100% of the time, right? So God answers every prayer. Sometimes it's not the way we expect, but that's because He sees more than we do, and we can help our children see that. So that's an instance of where that sincerity can come out also in our growth of living a prayer life. The other thing I would say is maybe as children grow up, we can help them see that there's kind of a larger context to prayer, that sometimes our prayer starts to stumble, not because God is allowing us to have a little period of dryness or whatever, but because maybe there's something that we're doing in our life that's hindering the flow of grace. Maybe it's a question of reforming our life, which of course we continue to pray even though we're sinners, and but at the same time there could be ways that we're saying no to God, and maybe He's inviting us into a deeper relationship, kind of that remote preparation for prayer, remote context for prayer. Also helping children kind of grow in habitual prayer, right? Prayers throughout the day, little aspirations or whatever it might be. And kids develop habits pretty quickly. To have that opportunity to, when someone is really young, to form them in that habit of just kind of saying, whispering little prayers, or when you come in or out of the house or whatever it might be, just these habitual prayers, which once you forge that habit early on in life will often become a source of real grace down the road. So I think these are kind of some of the ways, but above all, I think it's just sort of seeing where the dispositions of the children are, and trying to, I always think in formation in the seminary, it's like it's best to cut along the grain, than against it, it's like if there's always something that can be encouraged rather than something to kind of work against. Sometimes we have to work against stuff, obviously, but if we can sort of see things and nurture that and sort of channel that, and I think that's true for prayer as well. Like some kids are going to be more into, some of the vocal prayers, and some are going to love going to adoration, some are going to find it really hard. So trying to figure out what is best for them too, individually.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so how would you respond to a student who, is taken to the chapel regularly and they spend some time in prayer there with a class, or, a child who goes with the family, and you do hear sometimes, it's not working. I'm not hearing anything. How do you respond?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is the scriptures, right? Augustine said that scriptures, we speak to God in prayer and He speaks to us in the scriptures, right? So bringing the scriptures, maybe just, maybe not the whole book, but maybe little things that the kids can pray with, and helping them to see some of the basics of Lectio Divina, right? Which is sort of a contemplative way, a meditative way and children are perfectly capable of doing Lectio Divina. I think helping them, maybe even in a group setting, do some kind of reflection on the prayer, on the scriptures together. I think especially some of the more graphical scenes, the scenes of healing or the scene of walking on the water, whatever it might be, and having the kids talk about what their insights are about that. I think the composition of place, that whole idea of like trying to engage all the senses and putting yourself on the beach and smelling the salt air, like doing that with kids and having them close their eyes, having them start to imagine things, that can be really helpful, I think. And kids often have great imaginations. And then I think as kids get older and it becomes a little bit more notional, those all still work, by the way. I think all of us can still do, Lectio Divina and composition of place and all that. But, there's the acronym ACTS, Acts of Prayer, which I think has been very helpful for a lot of people. Like, just if you have a few minutes in prayer, let me spend a little bit of time in adoration, which is A. Then contrition, sorrow for my sins. Thanksgiving, talk to God about what you're grateful for. Supplications, what you're asking Him for. And to know that God speaks to us in quiet, hidden ways, not only during our time of prayer, but very often. St. Therese of Lisieux used to say that she never really heard God in prayer, but she always heard His answer after prayer. So you sort of, sometime during the rest of the day, maybe that's when, okay, that's my answer. That's what the Lord wanted me to hear that or receive that consolation or to have that affection, that moment of affection from a friend. And that was really from God, and to be able to see His fingerprints throughout our day, I think is a helpful way to think about it. And kids can see that too. Like, well, God's going to answer your prayer. It's going to be in His own way. It's better for you that way, but it might come later today.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful for the kids and for their parents and this parent.
And this priest.
So we go from there to the final pillar. Again, we kind of have this tour de force through human formation, that foundational aspect, the spiritual formation of becoming aware of our relationship to our Father and Creator, the intellectual formation, which is so interesting. Boy, there's more I'd love to say here. Reading lists and art and practical recommendations throughout. But we'll finish with a couple of the points from apostolic formation. This idea of bringing the truths of the faith of our Creator to the world, and it strikes me that there can be a little bit of a tension here, and you kind of allude to it in the book, where on one hand we are in the world. Well, no, it's not in one hand; it's complete. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. Mm-hmm. So. As parents, we're called to strike this balance between fostering in our children a spirit of apostolate, of wanting to share the truth. On the other hand, this is an interesting time to be alive, and I'll just kind of let that rest there. There's interesting forces at work, messages everywhere, including in some of our kids' pockets, which is a difficult question. How do we balance this desire to be both apostolic on one hand, but then also protective on the other?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just as an initial starting point, most, especially when children are younger, their witness is going to be much more by example than by words, right? And so it's just really, it's forming them as you're already forming them, right? To be Christian children, to have the fortitude to say no when they have to say no, and to not deny that what they believe as Christians about our Lord Jesus. And so you're forming them in such a way just by your own example and by all the other virtues that you're already instilling in them, when they're in their friend's house or when they're, whatever it might be, that they're going to act in such a way that will be often counterintuitive and countercultural to many other people. And that in itself is their apostolic work, right? So in a way, you're just building the foundations for a much more engaged relationship with the world later on. But I do think it begins really early, forming them to understand. I think a term, I don't know if I made up this term or not, but I love this term. So if I did, that's not very humble of me. But I think I must have heard it from somewhere else because I really like it. It's humble exceptionalism, right? It's this idea that kids come home and they're like, well, but Joey doesn't have, or they have, all these game boxes or whatever. And the answer of the parents needs to be, well, we're not like everybody else, and to be perfectly fine with that. Like it's not a judgment on them. It's not saying, you're saying that's not who we are. We believe something different, or we believe this is better for you, or whatever it might be. But this sense that we don't have to be like everybody else, and it's like, of course we're not. And having kids hear that early on, it can lead to some spiritual pride, and that might have to be corrected later on, or kind of whatever, comparisons and different things, looking down on others, whatever. And all that would need to be corrected. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, right? Because we are different, right? And as Catholics, we necessarily as you said, we're in but not of the world. And that's going to look different. And that's always been, from the primitive ancient church to the present day, the strongest way that she has spread her message. It's just by Christians, people saying, what do they have? I want what they have, right? It's because they're living differently. It's precisely because they don't look like everybody else and act like everybody else. And yet are still in the world and still have jobs and still have families and yet they are somehow much more joyful. They're much more engaged in their kids' lives. They're so much, they're flourishing in ways that I'm not, and I want that. And what's the key? The key is their faith, right? And so I think that's going to be typically how we are most effective in spreading the faith. But still, I mean, I think that having that clear sense that we have something to offer others, and then as the kids grow up, they're going to bring home stories about so-and-so at school who is doing this or acting this way or whatever it might be, and that might be an opportunity to talk about it. They may have friends, and, hopefully if you've built up, once again, a culture of sincerity, they can talk about that, and you can give some suggestions on how they can help their friend, live a better life or go to church or whatever it might be. And so it's not so much, I think, a protectiveness that is needed so much as it is kind of an awareness that children are not going to know how to do this right away, and so to set up a culture in which they are free to do that. And if the parents themselves see themselves as having this kind of apostolic dimension of their lives, if they themselves are trying to be a good witness to others at work and at school or wherever it might be, then they're going to naturally want to instill that in their children. One of the points that the Second Vatican Council makes that I find so important. Because it's still a little bit of a misunderstanding out there about the apostolic vocation of the Christian, is that there is still sometimes a sense that priests and the church structure has to somehow send lay people out to do apostolate. And the Second Vatican Council is very clear that commission comes from the Lord Jesus himself, right? It doesn't come through the Pope or through bishops, or it comes directly from the Lord Jesus in our baptism, that everybody has been commissioned by Christ in ways that are suitable for their state in life and for their vocation and path and so forth, but they're all called to bring Jesus, to bring the message of the gospel to others, and that includes kids, and includes the parents of kids. So figuring out how to do that, and I mentioned in that fourth pillar that I think this is the one, ironically, that is most threatening, in the sense that it's the one that's most, maybe daunting is a better word. Yes. Because it's not really part of our Catholic culture too much in this country. Right. And so it needs to start, because we all have to be a part of this, and it may be very quiet, hidden ways, it may be less quiet, hidden ways, but people have different gifts. But I think it's something that we are being called to in a much deeper way today. Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're right. There is something kind of unique to our experience in this country where, we don't talk politics, we don't talk religion, but this is bigger than religion. This is, it's a better understanding of what religion is. It's relationship with a person. And so we ought to share that. And then one aspect, of course, of this apostolic formation is the question of vocation. And we've done a podcast before on this idea of how to foster awareness of vocation, and so we'll be sure to link that in the show notes. But there was one point in here, many points, but one that I'd love to tease out is you commented there's something special about the 11s, about being 11 years old and about 11th grade. Why are these ages special, and how should we respond as I don't know. I can speculate. I think they are special. I think my speculation is because 11 years old is right before you go down that deep descent into barbarism, and 11th grade is like you're starting to come back up on the other side.
It's so true.
It is, I think that those are ages in which we are kind of starting to discover who we are and make decisions about who we are. It's discovery maybe is not the best word for it, because discover is not something you choose, it's just you discover it. And there's an element of discovery, of course, but there are also just a lot of things that I'm going to choose to treat my friends this way. I'm going to choose to be this kind of a student. I'm going to choose to treat my parents and my brothers and sisters this way. I'm going to choose to be a Christian or not be a Christian. And I think those are the ages in which some of those decisions are most poignant and kind of real and effective. When we make a choice at 11th, and when we're 11 years old or even 11th grade, we stand a much better chance of that choice kind of enduring for the rest of our life than if we make that choice when we're 42, or 4. So I think those are kind of some of the, and I think there are other elements too. I mean, 11 years old is obviously before puberty and things like that. There's kind of a clarity in the mind still somehow, that before all the hormones start rushing through us, and there's that element. But 11th grade also is like before you're making professional decisions, college decisions and things like that. And so I just think there's some practical dimensions to it. But I also just find that those are ages in which people are a little bit more receptive to hearing someone sort of intruding and saying, have you thought about this, or living this way, or making this choice about your life. Not 100%, but I think that they're important sort of to focus in a little bit more on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, the book full of great practical things that can be done at those ages and all others. But then again, all those practical pointers kind of rooted in this deeper, more beautiful, integrated reality that keeps it human. So, and for all that, I'm really grateful. And so we'll close out, we'll finish with a quick discussion of hope. It's the last of the sections in the book, the last chapter in this section on apostolic formation. And I think it's a wonderful way to end because some of us are going to be exposed to this book when we've just had our first child, or we're expecting our first child. Some of us are going to have this book when we've got perhaps grandkids, and we read this and we say, I wish I'd done a couple of things differently. And it's interesting. Many years ago, I sort of had this sense that, okay, we just need to, help these kids be independent. And then once they hit college, then we're kind of done. But I was talking to some wiser, very intelligent, very beautiful, holy parents. And they commented something to the effect of, you think you're done when you're 18. I mean, just wait till your child is, seriously courting somebody that you might not be, or engaged with somebody that you're not a fan of, or just wait till your son comes home with that mortgage that he is just not at all prepared to handle. Like that's when it really gets interesting. Right. And so I think just ending with hope that if the kids are just doing great, then thanks be to God. If they're not, then thanks be to God for his commitment to walk with us. But again, I just think this idea of hope is so important. And there's a marvelous Chesterton quote that I was hoping you can kind of comment on, but I'll read it if I may. Hope goes, many think that hope goes with youth and lends to youth its wings of a butterfly. But I fancy that hope is the last gift given to man and the only gift not given to youth. The power of hoping through everything, the knowledge that the soul survives its adventures, that great inspiration comes to the middle-aged. God has kept that good wine until now. I'd never read that. It's from a book of Chesterton's that I hadn't read. I'm so grateful you put it here. Speak to us a little bit, Father, if you would, just about hope, how not only we can pass that on to our kids, but how we can kind of hold it ourselves as we're trying to give all of this to them, and sometimes they mess up. Yeah,
that's right. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, that quote is from Charles Dickens. I mean, it's Chesterton, but I think it's his book, Charles Dickens. Oh, okay. And I think he, if I'm not mistaken, he's talking about David Copperfield, who was always seen as like a kind of a fictional version of Charles Dickens with the blacking factory and stuff like that. And that poor child in there, with the boot blacking and stuff like that. And and because the child hadn't lived very long, like you can imagine the despair, in his heart. And that's not the case of it all. It's like, well, okay, I've been in situations like this before, and it's going to get better. I just have to kind of. This is a tough period, but good times are coming. Or whatever, however you want to think. It's not. There's a very kind of human sense that I think that Chesterton is getting at here, which is that with more experience, we're able to see with a little bit more, context, and that gives us hope. That's kind of, I think, the natural version. But the supernatural element of this is that hope is like faith and like charity and like prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. These are virtues. Hope is instilled in us also in baptism, like faith. And like faith, it can grow, right? And it starts as a seed. A seed is not a full-grown plant. So as we grow in the spiritual life, our capacity to hope, which by the way, is distinct from optimism, right? Optimism is just like, oh, it's going to be fine. Everything's, don't worry about it. Don't worry, be happy or whatever. Hope is this kind of grounded conviction that God has everything in hand. I think that hope is really closely connected to another chapter, and one of my favorite things to think about and talk about is supernatural outlook. This idea, just like, do we look at the world, we look at our lives, we look at everything as believers? We can be believers, and we can try to live our life very intentionally, but do we actually sort of, are those the lenses, the corrective lenses we put on? Do we see things in that light? Because when we do, everything sort of changes. Things that seem so small today are actually really big, from the perspective of eternity. And things which seem so huge today that, it's a catastrophe, from the light of eternity, it's like, well, it's not that big of a deal, Failed that test, okay, well, whatever. It's like, it's not a good thing, and, but it's not, whereas it might be that little act of kindness to somebody on the street. It's like, that is gold, So I think supernatural outlook and hope go hand in hand, because hope has this power. That's what a virtue is. It's a power given to us to see things in that way, to know that God has everything in hand, to trust his providence, that he's going to fulfill his promises. And that promise includes the unconditional love for each one of us, including our children, right? And to know that whatever mistakes we've made, or whatever mistakes our children have made, right? God knows that. He's taken it all in hand, and his love is unconditional. He's not going to give up on us until the very day we die, right? And when we have sort of made our final decisions. And so I think part of the hopefulness of parents who are believers is knowing that precisely they are not ultimately the parents of this child, right? That this child has an origin that precedes even them, right? They were able to produce the human matter, but then God had infused that immortal soul. And so he has a responsibility for that child and a love for that child that surpasses anything we could possibly dream. So I think that's where the virtue of hope comes in. It's a hope for ourselves, because, we see our own failings and flaws, and including flaws as parents. But we also kind of have a hope about that God will not give up on us, but also as parents that he won't give up on our children. And I think that sense of that kind of the bounce in our step that comes with the virtue of hope is one of the most important apostolic. That's why I put it under the apostolic, section, and not spiritual or something like that, because I think that this is what our world so desperately needs today. We live in a world that is really awash, I think, in anxiety and despair and isolation, and what we have as Christians is something that is incredibly attractive. That's not why we don't sort of fake that. It's something that's real, that comes from within. People could pick up on a fake, because there's plenty of substitutes out there, but the real thing happens in the heart of Christians, and when they live that way and they have that hope, the apostolic force is unstoppable, right? There is nothing out there that can compete with that. And that will bring many, many people to Christ. So it's a way of living our own lives with a lot more joy, supernatural outlook, and kind of, as I say, so the buoyancy, but it also is a great recipe for apostolic fruitfulness. Yeah, for sure. I love that idea, the image of the bounce in your step. That's fantastic. And it's, again, a great way to end in the sense that we can have hope through the highs and the lows of parenting, and there are many of each. It's also kind of cool because it's obviously a moniker of sorts, or a great descriptor of the patron of the seminary that you're leading. And so what a beautiful way to end with this idea of hope and being ourselves as parents witnesses to hope for our children, so they can become witnesses to hope to the rest of the world. So what a gift. So, Father, on behalf of just all the parents who've already benefited from this, and God willing, the others who will soon, really thanks for writing this book, and thank you very much for spending some time with us today. You're very welcome. Thank you. Our thanks once again to Father Griffin for his time here at the Heights and for everything that he does for the Archdiocese of Washington. This book is fantastic. Do check it out. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. While you're there, you can also consider signing up for the Teaching Essentials Workshop, June 16th to the 20th for teaching men. And you can learn more about this at heightsforum.org. Hop over to heights.edu. You can register there for the conference for Heights parents and your friends beyond the walls on passing the faith on to the next generation. Should be a great day. So a lot of good stuff happening. None of it possible without your support. Thank you so very much for everything you do to keep this mission going here on campus and to help us broadcast this mission beyond the walls of our school. There is a thirst for this. And so, again, thank you for allowing us to share all of this by
by means of the Heights Forum. To support our work, do visit heightsforum.org, click on support. Everything you do, again, continues the mission here on campus and helps us get the word out beyond the walls through this podcast, all these conferences, and all the rest of it. So it's an effort that is bearing fruit, and we thank you for being on this journey with us. Thanks for being a part of the community. We'll talk to you next week.